The autumn moon hung low over Cedar Ridge like a silver coin against black velvet, casting shadows across the prairie grass that whispered secrets in the wind. Ruth Holloway had just finished checking the livestock when she heard it. The sound that would change everything. Not the usual coyote calls or the rustle of tumbleweeds, but something far more human. Labored breathing coming from behind the woodshed, followed by the unmistakable groan of someone in pain. She found him collapsed against the split logs, his cavalry scout uniform torn and bloodied, one hand pressed tight against his side where dark wetness seeped between his fingers. His skin bore the bronze tone of the Cheyenne people, and his eyes, when they flickered open to meet hers, held both defiance and desperation. In that moment, with her lantern throwing dancing shadows across his face, Ruth made a choice that would test everything she believed about loyalty, humanity, and the invisible lines that divided their world. Before we dive deeper into Ruth's story, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this tale of courage and compassion moves you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind carried the scent of sage and approaching snow across the Wyoming territory, sweeping over the Holloway homestead where it stood solitary against the vastness. 3 miles from the settlement of Cedar Ridge, the house seemed to grow. From the earth itself, its weathered boards the color of dried wheat, its chimney reaching toward skies that stretched endlessly in every direction. The windows glowed amber in the gathering dusk, but tonight they seemed to watch the surrounding prairie with unusual wariness. Ruth Holloway moved through her evening chores with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had learned to manage, alone. At 28, she carried herself with quiet strength, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun, her hands roughened by honest work, but still gentle when they needed to be. Her dress, faded blue calico patched at the elbows, swayed as she moved from task to task, checking latches, securing shutters, preparing for another night without Sam. Her husband had been gone 6 weeks now, riding patrol with the 7th Cavalry. Out of Fort Laramie, his letters came sporadically, carried by supply wagons or passing travelers, each one carefully worded to avoid mentioning the increasing tensions that everyone knew simmered just beneath the surface of daily life. The defeat at Little Bighorn had sent ripples of fear and anger through every settlement, and the Army's response had been swift and often brutal. Scout units searched for hostiles, though Ruth had learned that term could mean anyone with copper skin who happened to be in the wrong place. The house creaked in the wind, a familiar sound that usually brought comfort, but tonight seemed to carry warnings. Ruth paused at the kitchen window, her reflection wavering in the glass as she gazed out at the darkening landscape. The root cellar doors were visible from here, set into the ground near the garden plot, and she found herself staring at them longer than necessary. Something felt different tonight, though she couldn't say what. She had just turned back to the stove when she heard it, a sound so faint it might have been imagination, except that living alone had sharpened her senses to every unusual noise. A scraping, dragging sound from outside, followed by silence so complete it seemed to press against her eardrums. Ruth's hand found the rifle Sam had left for her, checking that it was loaded before she moved toward the door. The night air bit at her face as she stepped onto the porch, lantern held high in one hand, rifle steady in the other. The circle of light revealed nothing unusual at first, just the familiar shapes of the barn, the chicken coop, the woodshed. But as she descended the steps, the scraping sound came again, this time accompanied by something that made her blood run cold, the ragged sound of someone fighting for breath. She found him behind the woodshed, half hidden in the shadows where the lantern light barely reached. His body was curled against the stacked logs as if seeking their solidity. One arm wrapped protectively around his middle, while the other clutched at the ground, fingers digging into the cold earth. Even in the dim light, She could see the dark, stains spreading across his shirt, the unnatural angle of his left leg, the way his chest rose and fell in shallow, painful gasps. Ruth lowered the rifle slowly, her mind racing through possibilities and consequences. The man wore the distinctive jacket of an army scout, but his features marked him clearly as Cheyenne. His hair, long and black, was matted with sweat and what might have been blood. A knife hung at his belt, but his hand made no move toward it. Instead, his eyes found hers, dark and pain-filled, but somehow still proud, still human in a way that cut through all the stories she'd heard about savage warriors and bloodthirsty raiders. She knelt beside him, setting the lantern on the ground, where its light could better reveal his injuries. The wound in his side was bad, a bullet hole that wept steadily, though whether from army rifles or tribal conflicts, she couldn't tell. His leg was clearly broken, the boot at an angle that made her stomach turn, but it was the fever already burning in his skin that worried her most. Without help, he would be dead by morning. "Please," he whispered, the word barely audible above. The wind. His English surprised her, accented but clear. Not soldiers, please." Ruth glanced toward the horizon where the Fort Laramie Road disappeared into darkness. If patrols found him here, they would hang him as a deserter or shoot him as an enemy, depending on which story suited them better. And if they found her helping him? She pushed the thought away. Some choices transcended consequences. "Can you walk at all?" she asked quietly, already knowing the answer. He tried to push himself up, managing only to slide further down. The woodpile before his strength gave out. Ruth made her decision then, born not of politics or loyalty to any flag, but from something simpler, the inability to watch another human being suffer when she had the power to help. The root cellar lay 20 feet away, its heavy wooden doors set at an angle into the earth. It had been built to store vegetables and preserves through the harsh winters, deep enough that the ground's natural insulation kept it cool in summer and prevented freezing in winter. More importantly, it was invisible from the road and could be locked from the outside. Moving him proved harder than she'd anticipated. He was taller than he'd appeared, while crumpled against the woodshed, and despite his injuries, his body was solid with muscle. Ruth had to half carry, half drag him across the yard, stopping every few feet when his breathing became too labored or when she needed to adjust her grip. He tried to help, pushing with his good leg, biting back groans that might carry on the night air. The cellar steps were the worst part. She went down first, supporting his weight as he descended backward, his broken leg dragging uselessly. By the time they reached the bottom, both were breathing hard, and fresh blood had soaked through his shirt. Ruth lit the cellar's lantern with shaking hands, revealing shelves lined with mason jars, sacks of potatoes, and bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. She cleared a space in the corner, laying down horse blankets from the storage chest to create a makeshift bed. As she helped him settle onto it, she got her first good look at his face in proper light. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 25, with sharp cheekbones and a strong jaw. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his breathing came in short, painful gasps. "Name?" she asked, as she began cutting away his blood-soaked shirt. "Daniel," he managed between clenched teeth. "Daniel Blackwolf." Ruth nodded, focusing on the wound rather than the implications of harboring someone with that surname. She'd heard it before, whispered in the general store when people thought she wasn't listening. The Blackwolf brothers were known throughout the territory. Warriors who rode with Crazy Horse, scouts who could disappear into the landscape like smoke, fighters who had been at Little Bighorn. The bullet had gone clean through, which was good, but the wound was already showing signs of infection. Ruth had learned frontier medicine by necessity, treating everything from Sam's farming accidents to her own injuries when he was away. She gathered what she needed, The bottle of whiskey Sam thought she didn't know about, clean cloth torn from her petticoats, needle and thread from her sewing basket, and the herbs she'd dried last summer. Willow bark for fever, yarrow for bleeding, echinacea for infection. "This will hurt," she warned, dousing the wound with whiskey. Daniel's body went rigid, his hands fisting in the blankets, but he made no sound beyond a sharp intake of breath. Ruth worked quickly, cleaning the wound, packing it with herbs, stitching the worst of the damage. His skin was hot with fever, and she worried about how much blood he'd already lost. The broken leg was beyond her skill to properly set, but she did what she could, splinting it with pieces of wooden crating and strips of cloth. Through it all, Daniel drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering words in Cheyenne that might have been prayers or curses or simple expressions of pain. When she'd done all she could, Ruth sat back on her heels, studying her patient in the lantern light. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His breathing had steadied somewhat, though the fever still burned bright in his cheeks. She'd seen men die from less severe wounds, but she'd also seen miraculous recoveries when the will to live burned strong enough. "Water," he whispered, eyes fluttering open. She helped him drink from the ladle, supporting his head with one hand. His eyes met hers over the rim, dark and questioning. "Why?" he asked when he'd finished drinking. Ruth considered the question, thought about all the reasons she shouldn't be doing this, all the dangers she was inviting into her life. But the answer, when it came, was simple. "Because you needed help," she said quietly. "And I was here." Something flickered in his expression, surprise perhaps, or gratitude, or simple bewilderment that a white woman would risk so much for an enemy. But before he could respond, his eyes closed again, and he slipped back into the restless sleep of the fevered. Ruth climbed the cellar steps slowly, her dress stained with blood, her hands trembling slightly from the aftermath of adrenaline. She paused at the top, looking back down at the wounded man who now lay hidden beneath her home. The lantern cast long shadows across the earthen walls, and for a moment she felt the weight of what she'd done settling onto her shoulders like a heavy cloak. Outside, she closed the cellar doors carefully, sliding the bolt into place. The lock was sturdy. It had to be to keep out coyotes and other scavengers, but she knew it wouldn't stop determined men. If soldiers came looking, if someone had seen Daniel making his way across the prairie, if word somehow reached the fort. She pushed these thoughts aside. What was done was done. The night had grown colder while she worked, and frost was already forming on the grass. Ruth gathered the bloody rags she'd discarded, knowing they would need to be burned rather than washed. As she turned toward the house, a movement near the tree line caught her eye. She froze, hand instinctively reaching for the rifle she'd left inside. For long moments she stood perfectly still, watching the darkness beyond her property. The wind rustled through the cottonwoods, and somewhere in the distance an owl called, long and low, but whatever she'd seen, or thought she'd seen, didn't show itself again. Still, the feeling persisted that she was being watched, that her act of mercy had already been witnessed by eyes she couldn't see. Inside the house, Ruth barred the door and checked all the windows, drawing the curtains tight. She built up the fire in the stove and set water to boil, her movements automatic as her mind churned through the implications of her choice. She would need to be careful now, more careful than she'd ever been. No unexpected visitors could be allowed near the cellar. She would have to explain any unusual comings and goings, maintain her normal routines, even while caring for a severely injured man. And then there was Margaret Thorne, Sam's sister, who lived in town but had a habit of arriving unannounced to check on poor Ruth, all alone out here. Margaret's disapproval of Ruth was barely concealed beneath a veneer of Christian duty. She found fault with everything from Ruth's housekeeping to her habit of reading books that weren't the Bible. if Margaret suspected anything. Ruth shook her head, forcing herself to focus on immediate concerns. Daniel would need fresh water and food when he woke. The fever would have to be watched carefully. The wound would need regular cleaning and fresh dressings. She mentally catalogued her supplies, already planning what she might need to quietly obtain from town without arousing suspicion. As she worked, preparing broth that could be easily swallowed and gathering more medical supplies, Ruth found herself thinking about the man in her cellar, Daniel Blackwolf. She'd heard stories, of course. Everyone had. The Blackwolf brothers were said to be ghosts on horseback, appearing and disappearing like morning mist, leading cavalry patrols into ambushes and then vanishing without a trace. Some called them heroes defending their people's land. Others named them murderers and renegades. But the man she'd found behind her woodshed hadn't looked like either hero or villain. He'd looked young and hurt and human, with fear in his eyes despite his warrior's pride. His hands, when she'd cleaned the blood from them, bore the calluses of someone who knew hard work. The few words he'd spoken had been polite, even formal, not what she'd expected from the fearsome savage of frontier tales. Ruth carried the supplies down to the cellar, moving quietly, despite knowing there was no one to hear. Daniel was awake when she arrived, his eyes tracking her movement in the lantern light. The fever had given his skin an unhealthy sheen, but his gaze was clear and watchful. "I brought broth," she said, setting down the tray she'd prepared. "And something for the pain." He struggled to sit up, and she quickly moved to help him, propping him against the wall with folded blankets. As she held the cup to his lips, she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. The fever was worse than she'd thought. "Thank you," he said after drinking, his voice hoarse but steady. His English, she noticed again, was better than many of the settlers she knew. "You speak English well," she observed, checking his bandages. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Mission school. Before." He gestured vaguely, encompassing everything that had led to this moment. "The fathers thought they could save our souls by teaching us your words." Did they succeed? In teaching words? Yes, in saving souls? His eyes met hers. "I think my soul was never lost, just different from what they expected." Ruth found herself oddly moved by this response. She'd heard so many speak of Indians as soulless heathens, savage children who needed civilizing, but the man before her spoke with a philosophical depth that challenged such simple categories. "Your brother," she said carefully, adjusting his splint. "Will they come looking for you?" Daniel's expression darkened. "Thomas knows I was scouting the soldier movements. When I don't return..." He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "Yes, they will come." A chill ran down Ruth's spine. "How many?" "Enough." His eyes studied her face. "You should let me go. The danger..." "You can't even stand," Ruth interrupted, "and that fever will kill you before you get a mile." She met his gaze steadily. "I knew the risk when I brought you. And down here? Why?" It was the same question he'd asked before, but this time it carried more weight, more urgency. Ruth considered her answer as she prepared the willow bark tea that would help with both fever and pain. "My grandmother was Irish," she said finally. "Came over during the famine. She used to tell stories about how they were treated. Lazy, drunk, violent, less than human. Sound familiar?" She handed him the tea. "She taught me that when someone needs help, you don't ask what flag they serve or what god they pray to. You just help." Daniel sipped the bitter tea slowly, his dark eyes never leaving her face. "Your husband, he is soldier?" "Yes." Ruth saw no point in lying. "With the 7th at Fort Laramie." "And if he knew?" Ruth's hands stilled on the bandages she was folding. It was a question she'd been avoiding, even in her own mind. Sam was a good man, kind and patient, but he was also a soldier who believed in duty and following orders. Would he understand? Would he see Daniel as she did, a wounded human being, or would he see only an enemy? "I don't know," she admitted quietly, "but he's not here, and you are." They sat in silence for a moment, the lantern flame casting dancing shadows on the earthen walls. Outside, she could hear the wind picking up, rattling the cellar doors. Winter was coming early this year. "Sleep now," she said, gathering the medical supplies. "I'll check on you in a few hours." As she climbed the steps, Daniel's voice stopped her. "They will come," he said again, and this time she heard the warning clearly. "My brothers, when they find I am missing, they will follow my trail. They will come here." Ruth turned to look at him, this wounded warrior who even now was trying to protect her. "Then we'll deal with that when it happens," she said simply, and closed the cellar doors behind her. The morning brought a deceptive peace to Cedar Ridge. Ruth woke to frost patterns on her windows and a sky the color of weathered pewter, promising snow before nightfall. Her first thought was of Daniel, alone in the darkness below. She dressed, quickly in the pre-dawn chill, wrapping a thick shawl around her shoulders before venturing outside. The prairie stretched endlessly under the pale light, grass bent and silver with frost. No movement disturbed the landscape except for a lone hawk circling high above, its cry sharp in the stillness. Ruth scanned the horizon carefully before opening the cellar doors, a habit already forming after just one night of harboring her dangerous secret. Daniel's fever had broken during the night, leaving him weak but lucid. His eyes followed her as she descended the steps with fresh water and clean bandages. In the lantern light, she could see the improvement in his color, though pain still. Etched lines around his mouth when he moved. "You should not come so often," he said as she checked his wound. "Someone will notice." Ruth continued her work methodically, cleaning the wound with gentle efficiency. "I live alone. My nearest neighbor is 2 miles east. As long as I maintain my routines, no one will suspect anything." "And when your routines change, when someone comes visiting?" She met his gaze directly. "Then I'll handle it." There was something in her voice that made him study her more carefully. This woman who had taken such risks for a stranger, an enemy by all definitions of their world. He had known white women before, the missionary wives with their proper ways and frightened eyes, the fort ladies who clutched their children close when Indians passed, the settlement women who bolted their doors at sunset. Ruth Holloway was different. "You are not afraid," he observed. "I'm terrified," she corrected, wrapping fresh linen around his torso. "But fear and doing what's right aren't mutually exclusive." As she worked, Ruth found herself talking more than usual. Perhaps it was the isolation finally breaking, or maybe the strange intimacy of caring for someone created its own confessional space. She told him about coming west as a bride, about learning to manage the homestead during Sam's long absences, about the loneliness that settled into your bones like winter cold. Daniel listened with the particular attention of someone trained to gather information, but also with genuine interest. When she paused, he offered pieces of his own story, growing up between 2 worlds, the mission school that tried to erase his heritage, the choice to serve as an army scout before the alliance crumbled after Little Bighorn. "They called us friendlies," he said with bitter humor, "until we weren't useful anymore." By mid-morning, Ruth had established a careful routine. She would check on Daniel before dawn and after dusk, times when her movements were least likely to be observed. During the day, she maintained her normal activities, tending the chickens, working in the garden, mending clothes by the window where she could watch the road. It was during one of these vigilant afternoons that she spotted the dust cloud rising from the direction of town. Her hands stilled on the patching she was doing, every nerve suddenly alert. The cloud grew larger, resolving into a horse and rider moving at an easy pace toward her homestead. Ruth recognized the rigid posture before she could make out the face. Margaret Thorne rode like she did everything else, with disapproving precision and an air of moral superiority that preceded her like a herald. Of all the people who might visit unexpectedly, Sam's sister was both the most likely and the most dangerous. There was no time to check on Daniel, barely time to ensure nothing suspicious showed in her appearance or manner. Ruth smoothed her hair, straightened her apron, and stepped onto the porch as Margaret's horse entered the yard. "Ruth!" Margaret called out, her voice carrying that particular tone of forced cheer that meant inspection rather than socialization. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Ruth replied, helping her sister-in-law dismount. "I was just doing some mending. Would you like some tea?" Margaret's sharp eyes swept the yard, lingering on the cellar doors before moving to examine Ruth's face. "Tea would be lovely. You look tired, dear. Have you been sleeping properly?" Inside the house, Ruth moved with careful normalcy, setting out her good china and slicing the last of her banana bread. Margaret settled into the parlor chair that gave her the best view of both the kitchen and the front windows, her back straight as a fence post. "I worry about you out here alone," Margaret began, accepting her tea with a critical glance at the cup. "It's not proper for a woman your age to be so isolated. Perhaps you should come stay in town until Samuel returns." "I appreciate your concern, but I'm managing quite well," Ruth replied, sitting across from her visitor. "The homestead requires daily attention." "Nonsense. The Henderson's boy could see to the animals. You need proper society, proper supervision." Margaret's tone suggested this wasn't a new thought. "There have been incidents lately." Ruth's hand remained steady on her teacup. "Incidents?" "Indian troubles, scouts and renegades roaming the territory. Colonel Briggs at the fort says they're looking for deserters from their own ranks. Savages turning on each other. It's what you'd expect, I suppose." The casual cruelty of the words made Ruth's jaw tighten, but she kept her expression neutral. "I haven't seen anyone pass by here." "Well, you must be vigilant. Lock your doors at night. Keep that rifle Samuel left you close at hand." Margaret leaned forward slightly. "In fact, I heard from Mrs. Patterson that soldiers were searching farms south of here just yesterday, looking for a wounded Indian scout who abandoned his post." Ruth felt ice form in her stomach, but her voice remained calm. "How frightening. Did they find him?" "Not yet, but they will. Colonel Briggs has patrols out day and night. He says this particular savage is dangerous, one of those Black Wolf brothers who've caused so much trouble." The name hung in the air. Between them, Ruth took a slow sip of tea, using the moment to compose herself. "I'll certainly be careful." Margaret's visit stretched through the afternoon, filled with gossip from town, criticism of Ruth's housekeeping, and repeated offers to relocate her to town where it's safe. Through it all, Ruth maintained a facade of polite attention while her mind raced with implications. Soldiers searching nearby farms, patrols day and night. They were closing in. When Margaret finally prepared to leave as the sun began its descent, she paused at the door with one final observation. "You seem distracted today, Ruth. Are you certain? You're all right?" "Just tired," Ruth replied. "The changing seasons always affect my sleep." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, but she nodded. "Well, do consider my offer. Town is so much more civilized than this wilderness, and safer especially now." Ruth watched her sister-in-law ride away until the horse and rider disappeared over the nearest rise. Only then did she allow herself to breathe fully, her hands shaking slightly as she gripped the porch rail. She waited another hour, forcing herself to complete normal evening chores before approaching the cellar. Daniel was awake, his face tight, with barely controlled pain. The day's confinement had clearly been difficult, and Ruth could see he'd tried to adjust his position, probably aggravating his injuries in the process. "You had a visitor," he said before she could speak. "My sister-in-law. She's gone now. I heard voices, tried to be still." His dark eyes searched her face. "There is news." Ruth hesitated, then told him everything Margaret had said. As she spoke, she watched his expression darken, not with fear, but with a warrior's assessment of danger. "They are searching systematically," he concluded. "They will come here soon. Then we need to move you." "Where?" "I cannot ride, cannot walk far, and my trail." He gestured toward his wounded side. "I left blood sign for miles. A child could track it." Ruth had been thinking about this problem all afternoon. "There's an old mine shaft about a mile north, abandoned for years. If we could get you there." Daniel shook his head. "You risk too much already. Let me go. I will take my chances with the patrols rather than see you hanged for helping an enemy." "You're not my enemy," Ruth said firmly. "You're a wounded man who needed help. That's all that matters. Your people will not see it that way. Then my people are wrong." They stared at each other in the lamplight, two individuals caught in currents larger than themselves. Outside, the wind had picked up, and Ruth could hear it testing the shutters, searching for weaknesses. "There is another way," Daniel said finally. "My brothers will come. If not tomorrow, then the next day. They will follow my trail here." Ruth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cellar's temperature. "How many?" 40, maybe more. Warriors painted for war. He must have seen her face pale because he continued quickly. "But they will not harm you if they know you helped. Me. I will tell them. And if they don't believe you, if they think I'm holding you prisoner." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "Then you must show them your true heart. Sometimes that is all we have. The truth of who we are when everything else is stripped away." The next morning brought the first snow of the season, light flakes that dusted the ground and would make tracking even easier. Ruth went about her chores with mechanical precision, her mind constantly working through possibilities and contingencies. She prepared extra medical supplies, gathered food that could travel, and tried not to think about 40 painted warriors descending on her homestead. It was just past noon when she saw them. 3 riders on the eastern ridge, sitting their horses with the stillness of men who knew how to observe without being observed. They were too far away to make out details, but something in their posture, their patience, marked them as military scouts. Ruth continued feeding the chickens as if she hadn't noticed, but her heart was hammering. The riders remained for perhaps 10 minutes before wheeling their horses and disappearing beyond the rise. They would be back, probably with a full patrol. She waited until she was certain they were gone before hurrying to the cellar. Daniel was already alert, having sensed her urgency before she spoke. "Soldiers," she said simply. "Scouting. They'll return with more men." Daniel struggled to sit upright, his face gray with effort. "Then I must go now. Better they find me on the prairie than here." "You won't make it 100 yards, Ruth protested. "Your fever may have broken, but you're still too weak." "Weakness is better than your death," he replied grimly. "Help me up." Before Ruth could respond, a sound froze them both. Hoofbeats, many of them, approaching fast. But not from the east where the scouts had been. From the north, where the broken country provided cover for those who knew how to use it. Ruth climbed the steps quickly, peering through the crack between the cellar doors. What she saw made her breath catch. Warriors, dozens of them, spreading out to surround her homestead with the fluid precision of men born to horseback. Their faces were painted in patterns of red and black, feathers adorned their hair, and weapons glinted in the afternoon sun. At their head rode a man who could only be Thomas Blackwolf. Even at a distance, the resemblance to Daniel was clear. The same strong features, the same powerful build. But where Daniel's eyes held thoughtfulness, this man radiated barely contained violence. Ruth's hands trembled as she descended back to where Daniel waited. "Your brothers," she said unnecessarily. "They're here." Daniel's expression was unreadable. "Help me stand. I must speak with them before." The sentence was cut short by the sound of her front door splintering. Ruth heard boots on her floorboards, items being overturned, voices calling in Cheyenne. The cellar doors would be next. "Stay behind me," Daniel commanded, somehow finding the strength to push himself upright against the wall. "Whatever happens, stay behind me." The cellar doors flew open with a crash, and sunlight flooded the space. Warriors poured down the steps, weapons ready, faces fierce behind their paint. They stopped short at the sight of Daniel, wounded but standing, one arm protectively extended toward the white woman behind him. Thomas Blackwolf descended last, his movements deliberate and controlled. His eyes took in the scene. His brothers, injuries, the medical supplies, the obvious care that had been given. When he spoke, it was in Cheyenne, the words flowing too fast for Ruth to catch more than tone. Daniel responded in the same language, his voice steady despite his obvious pain. The exchange continued for several minutes, growing heated at times, with gestures toward Ruth and the evidence of her nursing. Finally, Thomas turned to Ruth, and she saw intelligence in his eyes that matched his brother's. When he spoke, his English was accented but clear. "You are the one who found him." Ruth stepped forward, though Daniel tried to hold her back. "Yes. And you chose to help him, knowing what he is, what we are?" Ruth met his gaze directly. "I chose to help a wounded man. His tribe, his race, his allegiances, none of that mattered when I found him bleeding in my yard." Thomas studied her for a long moment, then gestured to the medical supplies, the clean bandages, the obvious care taken. "You could have turned him over to the soldiers, collected a reward, been called a hero by your people." "I've never been interested in that kind of heroism," Ruth replied quietly. A ghost of a smile touched Thomas's stern features. He said something in Cheyenne to the other warriors, and Ruth felt the tension in the cellar shift, weapons lowering slightly. "My brother says you saved his life," Thomas continued, "that you risked everything to help him." "Anyone would have done the same," Ruth said, though they all knew it wasn't true. "No," Thomas replied. "Not anyone. Very few." He was quiet. For a moment then, "The soldiers are coming. We tracked their scouts. They will be here before sunset." Ruth felt the blood drain from her face. If the soldiers found her here with 40 Cheyenne warriors, the conclusion would be foregone. At best, she'd be branded a traitor, at worst. "We will take my brother now," Thomas announced. "You will come with us." "What?" Ruth's voice came out sharper than intended. "You cannot stay," Daniel interjected, speaking English for her. "Benefit. When the soldiers find the cellar, see evidence of medical care, they will know. They will arrest you, try you for treason." "This is my home," Ruth protested. "My husband, your husband is a soldier who has been gone for weeks," Thomas cut in. "He cannot protect you from this." Ruth looked around the cellar, at the blood-stained bandages, the obvious signs of extended care, the very presence of these warriors in her home. The evidence was damning. Even if she cleaned everything, burned every trace, there would be questions. Margaret's visit, the timing, the soldiers' search pattern, it would all point to her guilt. "Where would you take me?" she asked quietly. "To our winter camp," Thomas replied. "You would be safe there until—" He paused, seeming to consider his words. "Until other arrangements can be made." Ruth thought of Sam, somewhere out on patrol, unaware that his wife's act of mercy was about to destroy their life together. She thought of the homestead they'd built, the dreams they'd shared, the future they'd planned. All of it balanced against the simple fact that she had saved a life and would likely pay for it with her own if she stayed. "I need to gather some things," she said finally. Thomas nodded. "Be quick. We must be gone before the soldiers arrive." Ruth climbed from the cellar in a daze. Warriors filled her home, but they stood quietly now, almost respectfully. She gathered essentials with hands that barely trembled. Warm clothes, her medicine bag, the photograph of Sam from their wedding day. She paused at her writing desk, then quickly penned a note. "Sam, I found a wounded man and chose to help him. By the time you read this, you'll know the rest. I'm sorry for the pain this will cause you, but I'm not sorry for the choice I made. Please understand. All my love, Ruth." She placed the letter prominently on the mantel, then turned to find Thomas watching her. "You are ready." Ruth took one last look around her home. At the quilt she'd made, the curtains she'd hung, the life she was leaving behind. Yes, they rigged a travois for Daniel, who was too weak to sit a horse despite his efforts to appear otherwise. Ruth was given a gentle mare and found herself surrounded by warriors who seemed uncertain whether she was prisoner or guest. As they prepared to leave, she saw Thomas giving rapid orders, sending scouts in different directions. "We will lay false trails," he explained to her. "Make them think we went south toward the Platte. By the time they realize the deception, we will be beyond their reach." As the war party moved out, Ruth turned for one last look at her homestead. The sun was already low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Soon the soldiers would arrive, find the empty house, the abandoned cellar, the letter on the mantel. Soon her old life would be over entirely. But as she rode, through the gathering dusk, surrounded by men her world called savage, carrying medical supplies to tend a patient who had become something like a friend, Ruth felt an unexpected peace. She had chosen compassion over convention, humanity over hatred. Whatever came next, she could live with that choice. The snow began to fall more heavily as they rode north, covering their tracks, obscuring the past, writing a new story on the blank page of the prairie. Behind them, the abandoned homestead grew smaller and smaller until it was just another shadow in a landscape full of shadows. A monument to the life she was leaving behind and the uncertain future she was riding toward. Daniel's voice drifted back to her from the travois, weak but determined. "Thank you." Ruth urged her horse forward until she rode beside him. "Rest now," she said gently. "We have a long journey ahead." As night fell complete and cold around them, the war party moved like ghosts across the prairie, carrying with them an unlikely alliance born of compassion and necessity. Somewhere behind them, soldiers would be discovering an empty house and a letter that told of choices made in the space between right and easy. Somewhere ahead lay a winter camp and an uncertain future. But for now, there was only the snow falling soft and silent, covering everything in a blanket of new beginnings. The Cheyenne camp materialized from the winter landscape like something conjured from the earth itself. Nestled in a valley between protective ridges, the teepees rose in organized circles, their painted symbols barely visible through the steadily falling snow. Smoke curled from countless fires, and the sound of dogs barking mixed with children's voices and the whinny of horses. Ruth had expected chaos, perhaps hostility. Instead, she found herself entering a world of surprising order and warmth. Women emerged from teepees to watch their arrival. Children peered around their mothers' skirts, and elderly men paused in their activities to observe the strange procession. 40 warriors returning with a wounded scout and an even more unlikely guest. Thomas Blackwolf raised his hand, calling out in Cheyenne, and people began to gather. Ruth caught fragments of meaning in their faces, curiosity, concern, suspicion. But when they saw Daniel on the travois, expressions shifted to alarm and compassion. Several women hurried forward, experienced hands already reaching to assess his condition. "My wife, morning song," Thomas said, as a woman with kind eyes and premature gray in her dark hair approached. She is our healer." Morning Song studied Ruth with intelligent eyes before turning her attention to Daniel. Her examination was thorough and professional, reminding Ruth of the best doctors she'd known back east. When she spoke to Thomas in rapid Cheyenne, her tone carried unmistakable authority. "She says you did well," Thomas translated. "The wound is clean, the fever controlled, without your care." He didn't finish, but the meaning was clear. They transferred Daniel to a teepee that Ruth learned served as the camp's healing lodge. Inside, buffalo robes created a warm nest, herbs hung from the lodge poles, and a small fire provided both heat and light. Morning Song began preparing poultices with practiced efficiency while Ruth watched, recognizing some preparations, puzzling over others. "You will stay here," Thomas announced, gesturing to a neighboring teepee. "It belonged to my aunt who passed last moon. Her daughter lives with her husband's family now." Ruth found herself in a space that was both foreign and surprisingly comfortable. The teepee was larger than she'd expected. The buffalo hide walls decorated with geometric patterns. A central fire pit was surrounded by raised sleeping areas covered in furs. Storage parfleches lined the walls, and everything had its place in an organization she was beginning to appreciate. That first night, exhaustion claimed her quickly. She slept deeper than she had in months, wrapped in buffalo robes that smelled of smoke and sage. When she woke, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings, she found a young woman tending the fire. "I am White Dove," the girl said shyly in careful English. "Daughter of Thomas, I bring food." The meal was simple but satisfying. A stew of venison and wild roots, flatbread, and tea made from plants Ruth didn't recognize. As she ate, White Dove watched her with barely concealed curiosity. "You are the woman who saved Uncle Daniel," she said finally. "Everyone talks of it. What do they say?" Ruth asked, curious herself about how the camp viewed her presence. White Dove glanced toward the teepee entrance as if checking for listeners. "Some say you must be touched by spirits to risk so much. Others think you had reasons we do not know. My grandmother says the hearts of people reveal themselves in their choices, not their birth." Over the following days, Ruth found herself drawn into the rhythm of camp life. She spent mornings with Morning Song in the healing lodge, learning Cheyenne medicine while sharing her own knowledge. The older woman was a patient teacher, explaining through demonstration and simple words when language barriers arose. Daniel's recovery progressed steadily under their combined care. The infection retreated, the wound began to properly heal, and his strength returned incrementally. During his waking hours, he served as translator and cultural bridge, helping Ruth navigate the complex social dynamics of the camp. "You must understand," he explained one afternoon as Ruth changed his bandages. "My people see the world differently than yours. Everything is connected, the land, the animals, the spirits, the people. What you did for me affects the whole web of relationships." "Is that why some still watch me with suspicion?" Ruth asked, having noticed the guarded looks from certain camp members. "Trust is earned slowly here," Daniel replied. "And you are still Wasichu, white. Your people have broken many promises." Ruth couldn't argue with that. Even in her short time on the frontier, she'd seen how treaties were made and discarded. When convenient, how promises of peace lasted only until gold was discovered or land was coveted. As the days passed, she began to learn the names and stories of those around her. There was Old Bear, the camp's storyteller, whose tales around the evening fires drew crowds of children and adults alike. Spotted Eagle, a warrior whose scarred face told of many battles, but whose gentle way with horses revealed a different side. Small Flower, a widow who had lost her husband at Little Bighorn, but who sang lullabies to her children with a voice of heartbreaking beauty. The children were the first to fully accept her presence. They would appear at her teepee entrance, giggling behind their hands, daring each other to speak to the strange white woman. Ruth had always loved children, though she and Sam had not yet been blessed with any. She began teaching them simple English words while they taught her Cheyenne, turning language lessons into games that soon had them shrieking with laughter. One particularly bold child, a boy of perhaps 7 winters named Jumping Rabbit, appointed himself her special guide. He would arrive each morning to show her something new, how to properly bank a tippy fire where the women gathered water, which dogs were friendly and which to avoid. "You must learn our ways," he announced importantly one morning. "So you do, not shame yourself." Through Jumping Rabbit and the other children, Ruth began to see the camp not as a temporary refuge, but as a complex society with its own laws, customs, and beauty. She watched women working together to tan hides, their movements synchronized through years of practice. She observed men crafting weapons with the precision of artists, each arrow fletched with personal symbols. She saw elders teaching young, one's knowledge passing between generations like a river that never ceased to flow. But she also saw the underlying tensions and fears. Scouts came and went at all hours, bringing news of troop movements and settler activities. Warriors sat in council late into the night, their voices low and urgent. Food stores were carefully rationed, and Ruth realized the camp was preparing for a hard winter made harder by the constant threat of military pursuit. One evening, as she helped Morning Song prepare medicines, the older woman spoke more directly than usual. "You must decide soon," she said, her English improving through their daily interactions. "Stay or go, both paths have thorns." "I don't understand," Ruth replied, though she suspected she did. "My husband speaks of taking you to the fort under flag of truce, explaining to your people what happened, but—" Morning Song's hands stilled on the herbs she was grinding. "Truth is a weak shield against hatred." Ruth had been trying not to think about the future, living day by day in this strange borderland between worlds. But she knew Morning Song was right. She couldn't remain in limbo forever. That night, Thomas called her to his teepee. The lodge was larger than others, befitting his status as a war chief. Weapons hung from the lodge poles, and painted records of battles decorated a beautiful buffalo robe. But it was also a family home, with children's toys visible and the smell of cooking filling the space. "Sit," Thomas said, gesturing to a place by the fire. His expression was grave. "We must speak of what comes next." Ruth settled onto the offered buffalo robe, accepting a cup of tea from Morning Song. She waited, having learned that important conversations among the Cheyenne often began with silence. "My scouts bring word from the settlements," Thomas began finally. "Your husband has returned to find you gone. The soldiers searched for days, but found no trail. Now they say you were taken by force, that we raided your homestead and carried you away as prisoner." Ruth felt her heart constrict. "Sam thinks I'm a captive." "It is easier for them to believe this than the truth," Thomas replied. "That you chose to help an enemy, that you came with us willingly. But the letter I left may never have been found, or was hidden by those who prefer a different story." Thomas's eyes were sympathetic, but realistic. "Your people need their narrative of savage Indians and innocent white women. The truth disturbs this." Ruth stared into the fire, watching the flames dance. She thought of Sam, probably sick with worry, leading patrols to search for her. Of Margaret, no doubt confirming everyone's worst fears about leaving a woman alone on the frontier. Of the neat categories her world insisted upon, and how thoroughly she had stepped outside them. "What are my choices?" she asked quietly. "3 paths," Thomas replied. "First, we take you to the fort under truce flag. You tell your story. Perhaps they believe you, perhaps not. At best, you faced trial for aiding an enemy. At worst, he didn't need to elaborate. Second, you remain with us through winter. In spring, when the snows melt and tempers cool, we try again to negotiate your return. Time sometimes softens hard positions. And third, Thomas and Morningsong exchanged glances. Third, you continue on to Canada with those of our people who seek refuge there, start a new life beyond reach of American law. Each option felt like a door closing on some part of her life. Ruth thought of the homestead she and Sam had built, the dreams they'd shared, the future they'd planned. Then she thought of the cell that likely awaited her at Fort Laramie, the trial that would brand her traitor, the noose that might end all dreams entirely. "I need time to think," she said. Thomas nodded. "Of course. But know this, whatever you choose, you have earned your place here. You saved my brother. You have shown respect for our ways. You are welcome among us for as long as you wish." Ruth returned to her teepee, feeling the weight of impossible choices. She sat by her fire, unconsciously mimicking the cross-legged posture. She'd learned from the Cheyenne women and tried to chart a path through the wilderness of her options. A soft scratch at her teepee entrance interrupted her thoughts. "Enter," she called, expecting perhaps White Dove or one of the children. Instead, Daniel ducked through the opening, moving carefully but no longer with the weakness of the severely wounded. He settled across from her, his recovery evident in the steadiness of his movements. "You spoke with my brother," he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, he laid out my choices. None of them lead back to the life I knew. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry, this is my fault. If you hadn't helped me, I would have lived with the knowledge that I let a man die when I could have saved him." Ruth interrupted. "That's not a choice I could have made. Even knowing the cost?" Ruth considered this, maybe especially knowing the cost. The easy choice would have been to turn away, to let fear decide. I've seen too much of where that leads. Daniel studied her across the fire. "You are not like other white women I have known, and you're not like the savage warrior I was taught to fear," she replied. "Perhaps that's the real tragedy, how rarely we see each other as we truly are." They sat in companionable silence, the fire crackling between them. Outside, she could hear the normal sounds of the camp settling for the night. Mothers calling, children, men checking horses, dogs barking at shadows. "There is a fourth choice," Daniel said suddenly. Ruth looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" "My brother sees only three paths because he thinks in terms of war and peace, us and them. But you have already shown there is space between these. Absolutes." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Among my people, adoption is sacred. When someone is taken into a family, they become fully part of us, protected by all the rights and obligations of kinship. Are you suggesting, if you were adopted into our clan, you would no longer be a white woman who aided an enemy? You would be Cheyenne who helped her brother. It changes everything, legally, spiritually, socially." Ruth felt her breath catch. "But I'm not Cheyenne. I don't know your language fully, your ceremonies, you've been learning. The children already call you aunt. Morningsong speaks of you as daughter, and adoption doesn't erase who you were. It adds to who you are." The proposition was staggering. To be adopted into the tribe would mean more than legal protection. It would mean committing to an entirely new identity, new obligations, new ways of seeing the world. Yet as Ruth thought about it, she realized she had already begun this transformation. Each day in the camp had added layers to her understanding, connections to her heart. "Would your people accept this?" she asked. "Truly accept it? Some already have, others would need time, but adoption is ancient law among us. Once done, it cannot be undone or questioned." Ruth stared into the fire, seeing her possible futures, dancing in the flames. Return to face trial and possibly death, wait in limbo through a long winter, flee to Canada as a refugee, or step fully into this new world that had unexpectedly opened before her. "I need to speak with your brother again," she said finally. The next morning brought clear skies and bitter cold. Ice crystals hung in the air, and breath steamed from both humans and horses. Ruth found Thomas supervising the distribution of hunting parties, his leadership evident in the quiet authority with which he gave instructions. When she approached, he dismissed the other warriors with a gesture and turned to her. "You have decided." "I have questions first," Ruth replied, "about adoption, about what it would mean." Thomas's expression shifted through surprise to thoughtful consideration. "Daniel spoke to you of this?" "He suggested it as a fourth path. But I need to understand fully before I could even consider it." They walked together toward the edge of camp, where the noise of daily life faded into the whisper of wind through bare cottonwoods. Thomas was silent for a long time, and Ruth had learned to wait for his thoughts to form into words. "Adoption among our people is not like your Christian baptism," he began. "It is not water sprinkled on the head while words are spoken. It is a binding of spirits, a weaving of lives. The adopted person gains family, clan responsibilities. They also gain protection and obligations. Yes, to live as one of the people, to honor our ways, to stand with us in good times and bad." He turned to face her directly. "It is not a thing done lightly or temporarily. Once you are Cheyenne, you are Cheyenne, until death." Ruth thought of all the bonds she'd formed in her short time here, with Morning Song, who taught her healing, with the children who called her aunt, with the women who had begun including her in their daily work. She thought too of the world she'd left behind, where her act of mercy had made her criminal. "If I chose this path," she said slowly, "what of my husband, my marriage?" Thomas's expression softened slightly. "That would be for you to decide. Some who are adopted maintain ties to their old life. Others cut them cleanly. But know this, your husband is a soldier sworn to fight us. That creates complications." Complications. Such a mild word for the chasm that now existed between her and Sam. Ruth wondered if he would even recognize the woman she was becoming, shaped by experiences he couldn't imagine, allied with people he was duty-bound to consider enemies. "I need one more day," she said. That day passed in a blur of ordinary activities that had become precious through their fragility. Ruth helped Morning Song prepare medicines, played with the children, assisted in scraping a hide under the patient guidance of Spotted Eagle's wife. Each interaction felt weighted with potential finality. Either she would commit fully to this life, or these connections would become memories. As evening approached, she found herself at Daniel's teepee. He was sitting outside working on fletching arrows with careful precision. His wound still pained him. She could see it in the careful way he moved, but he no longer needed constant care. "Tomorrow I choose," she said without preamble. He nodded, not looking up from his work. "Whatever you decide, know that you gave me back my life. That debt can never be repaid." "There is no debt," Ruth replied firmly. "There never was." Now he did look up, his dark eyes meeting hers. "Among my people, saving a life creates a bond that death itself cannot break. Whether you stay or go, whether you become Cheyenne or remain white, you are my sister in spirit. This I declare before all witnesses." The formal tone of his words, the ceremony inherent in the declaration, moved Ruth deeply. She felt tears gather, but didn't try to hide them. Among the Cheyenne, she'd learned, tears were not weakness, but honesty. That night, the camp gathered for a ceremony honoring the successful return of the war party. Ruth watched from the edges as warriors danced, drums beat rhythms that seemed to match her heartbeat, and voices rose in songs of thanksgiving and power. The firelight painted faces in flickering gold and shadow, and for a moment she saw not strangers but family, not savages but people, not enemies but siblings in the great human struggle to survive and thrive. When she finally retired to her teepee, Ruth knew her decision was already made. Perhaps it had been made that night in her root cellar when she'd chosen compassion over fear, or during the long rides through snow when warriors had protected her, as carefully as they did their own women, or in the quiet moments when morning song had shown her which plants healed and which harmed, knowledge shared as freely as between mother and daughter. She slept deeply and woke to a dawn that painted the sky in shades of rose and gold. Ice crystals on the teepee walls caught the light like scattered diamonds. Somewhere in the camp, a child laughed, high and clear as birdsong. Ruth rose, dressed carefully in the elk-skin dress White Dove had helped her make, and stepped out to meet her future. The camp was already stirring, smoke rising from morning fires, women heading toward the stream with water containers. She found Thomas and Morning, sung together, sharing their morning meal. When she approached, they made space for her by their fire, offering food without words. She ate slowly, tasting each bite as if for the first time. "I have decided," she said when the meal was finished. Thomas waited, his expression neutral but his eyes alert. "If your people will have me, I choose adoption. I choose to become Cheyenne." Morningsong reached out and took her hand, squeezing gently. Thomas nodded slowly, gravely, as if he had expected this answer but still felt its weight. "Then we will prepare," he said simply. "The ceremony will be at the full moon, 3 days hence. You understand what this means, what you give up, what you gain." "I understand," Ruth replied, and realized she did. She was choosing not just survival, but transformation, not just safety, but belonging, not just a legal fiction, but a spiritual truth. Word spread through the camp quickly. Some received it with joy, others with reservation, but all with the recognition that something significant was about to occur. The adoption of a white woman into the tribe was not unprecedented, but it was rare enough to be noteworthy. The next 3 days passed. In a whirl of preparation, Ruth was instructed in the ceremonies to come, taught the responses she would need to make, prepared for the spiritual significance of what was about to occur. Women she had barely spoken to before came to visit, bringing gifts, a beaded bag, a carved comb, a blanket woven with intricate patterns. Each gift came with stories, connections, threads that would weave her into the fabric of the people. On the eve of the ceremony, Daniel came to her teepee for the last time as outsider to outsider. After tomorrow, their relationship would be fundamentally altered. She would be Cheyenne, he would be her tribesman, the chasm of race that had defined. Their initial meeting would be bridged by ritual and law. "Are you afraid?" he asked. Ruth considered the question honestly. "Not afraid, but aware. Tomorrow I die as Ruth Holloway, and am reborn as someone new. That's not a small thing." "No," he agreed, "it's not. But remember, the seed must die for the plant to grow. The caterpillar must dissolve to become the butterfly. Transformation is always a kind of death and birth combined." They sat together as the stars emerged, no longer white woman and Cheyenne warrior, but two people on the edge of great change. Tomorrow would bring the ceremony, the adoption, the formal beginning of Ruth's new life. But tonight, in the quiet of her teepee, with the camp settling into sleep around them, she savored this moment between worlds. When Daniel finally rose to leave, he paused at the entrance. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." Ruth smiled, feeling peace settle over her like a blanket. "Thank you for showing me that there's more than one way to be human." As his footsteps faded into the night, Ruth prepared for sleep one last time as the woman she had been. Tomorrow, the full moon would rise, the drums would sound, and she would step through the gateway of ceremony into a new identity, a new family, a new understanding of what it meant to belong. The stars wheeled overhead, constant and eternal, caring nothing for the human divisions of race and nationality. Under their light, all people were simply people, all struggles simply struggles, all choices simply choices. And Ruth Holloway, soon to be reborn with a Cheyenne name and Cheyenne identity, slept peacefully in the knowledge that she had chosen love over fear, connection over isolation, transformation over stagnation. The morning would bring challenges. Enough, but tonight, wrapped in buffalo robes and surrounded by the quiet breathing of a community that had opened its arms to her, she rested in the certainty of her choice. The morning of the full moon ceremony dawned crisp and bright, with the kind of clarity that comes only in winter when the air itself seems crystallized. Ruth woke before sunrise, her sleep having been light and filled with dreams of soaring eagles and running water. White dove and morning song arrived as the first rays painted the teepee walls gold, carrying items for her preparation. "Today you cross between worlds," Morning Song said softly, her hands gentle as she helped Ruth dress in the ceremonial elk-skin dress that had been specially made for this occasion. The garment was beautiful beyond anything Ruth had imagined. Cream-colored hide, soft as butter, decorated with intricate beadwork, depicting the 4 directions and adorned with elk teeth that clicked softly when she moved. White Dove worked on Ruth's hair, brushing it until it shone, then braiding it in the traditional style with strips of red trade cloth woven through. Each action felt weighted with significance, transforming her external appearance to match the internal journey she was about to undertake. "The people gather already," White Dove whispered, excitement evident in her voice. "Even Singing Crow came down from the northern camp. She is the oldest among us. They say she remembers when our people first met the white traders." Ruth felt a flutter of nervousness. The adoption ceremony would be witnessed by not just this camp, but by representatives from other bands who had traveled through the snow to attend. The gravity of what she was about to do settled over her like a mantle. As the sun climbed higher, she could hear the camp stirring to unusual activity. Voices called greetings as visitors arrived. Children ran between teepees with barely contained energy, and somewhere in the distance, drums began a preliminary rhythm that seemed to echo in Ruth's chest. Thomas appeared at her teepee entrance, dressed in his finest regalia. His war shirt was decorated with hair locks and beadwork that told the story of his victories, and eagle feathers adorned his carefully braided hair. But it was the solemnity in his expression that struck Ruth most forcefully. "It is time to begin," he said simply. Ruth emerged from the teepee to find the camp transformed. People lined the path to the central ceremonial ground, faces painted for celebration, finest clothes displayed. She recognized many. The children who had become her teachers, the women who had shared their skills, the warriors who had protected her during their journey here. But there were also strangers, drawn by news of this unusual adoption. The ceremonial ground had been carefully prepared. A large fire burned at the center, surrounded by a circle of elders and spiritual leaders. Sweet grass and sage scented the air, their smoke rising like prayers to the crystal blue sky. The head medicine man, whose name translated to walks with spirits, stood waiting with his sacred pipe. As Ruth approached the circle, guided by Thomas and Morning Song, the drums shifted to a deeper, more formal rhythm. The crowd grew quiet, even the children sensing the importance of what was about to unfold. Ruth's heart pounded so loudly, she wondered if others could hear it over the drums. Walks with Spirits began to speak in Cheyenne, his voice carrying the authority of countless generations. Daniel, standing among the witnesses, translated quietly for Ruth's benefit, though she had learned enough of the language to catch the general meaning. We gather under the eye of Maheo, the All-Father, to witness a soul choosing its path. The white woman Ruth Holloway comes before us, but she will leave as one of the people. This is old magic, old law. Once spoken, it cannot be unspoken. Once done, it cannot be undone. The medicine man lit the sacred pipe, offering smoke to the four directions, to the earth below and sky above. When he passed it to Ruth, she accepted it with hands that trembled only slightly, drawing the smoke as she had been taught, feeling its harsh warmth fill her lungs. What followed was a ceremony both beautiful and profound. Ruth was asked to walk the circle sunwise, stopping at each of the four directions where different elders waited. At the east, she was given an eagle feather, symbol of new beginnings and spiritual connection. At the south, a small pouch of earth from the heart, of Cheyenne territory representing her new homeland. At the west, a piece of thunderstone, embodying strength and transformation. At the north, white sage for wisdom and purification. With each gift came blessings and obligations, spoken in Cheyenne, but translated by designated speakers. Ruth repeated the responses she had learned, her voice growing stronger with each station. The gifts were not just symbols but bonds, tying her to the land, the spirits and the people in ways that went beyond mere words. When she completed the circle, walks with spirits beckoned her to the center. The drums fell silent. In the sudden quiet, every small sound seemed amplified. The crackling of the fire, the whisper of wind through the camp, the breathing of hundreds of witnesses. Ruth Holloway, the medicine man intoned, speaking now in English for her benefit, "You have walked the sacred circle. You have received the gifts of the people. Now comes the moment of choosing. Will you accept the name we offer? Will you bind your spirit to our spirit, your path to our path, your heart to our heart?" Ruth looked around the circle, seeing faces both familiar and strange, friendly and skeptical. She thought of Sam, somewhere beyond these hills, probably leading another patrol in search of her. She thought of Margaret, no doubt telling everyone that savages had stolen her sister-in-law. She thought of the life she was leaving behind, the homestead, the familiar routines, the identity she had worn like comfortable clothes. But she also thought of the root cellar, of Daniel's eyes meeting hers in that first moment of decision, of the choice to help rather than turn away, of all the choices since that had led her to this moment, standing in the center of a sacred circle, poised between worlds. "I accept," she said, her voice clear and carrying. "I choose to become one of the people." A sound rose from the assembled crowd, not quite a cheer, more like a collective exhalation, as if everyone had been holding their breath. Walks with Spirits nodded solemnly and raised his hands. "Then receive your new name, the name by which the people will know you, the name that carries your spirit's true nature." He paused, letting the moment build. "From this day forward, you are Mapia Wing, Blue Sky Woman. For as the sky bridges earth and heaven, so do you bridge two peoples. As the sky shelters all beneath it without judgment, so did you shelter one who needed aid." The name settled over Ruth, now Blue Sky Woman, like a blessing. She felt something shift inside her, as if pieces of herself that had never quite fit suddenly aligned. The crowd began to sing, a welcoming song that rose and fell like waves, carrying her new name to the spirits. What followed was celebration. The formal ceremony gave way to feasting, dancing, and storytelling that would continue well into the night. Blue Sky Woman found herself passed from group to group, each wanting to welcome their new tribeswoman properly. Children who had been shy before now climbed into her lap freely. Women who had watched her with reservation now shared their most precious stories. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and amber, Daniel found her sitting quietly by one of the smaller fires, taking a moment of rest from the continuous celebrations. Blue Sky Woman, he said, testing the name. It suits you. She smiled, still adjusting to hearing it. I feel different, not changed exactly, but more myself, if that makes sense. It does, Daniel assured her. The whites believe naming is just words, but names have power. They call forth who we truly are. They sat together, watching the camp celebrate. Somewhere drums still beat, somewhere voices still sang. The adoption of Blue Sky Woman would be remembered in winter counts, the pictographic histories the people kept. Her choice would become part of their story, woven into the larger tapestry of survival and adaptation. There's something I must tell you, Daniel said after a long silence. My brother received word this morning. Your husband searches for you still. He refuses to believe you were taken by force. He says he knows his wife, that she would have left signs, fought back. He's been suspended from duty for defying orders to give up the search. Blue Sky Woman. She must think of herself by that name now. Felt her heart constrict. Sam, stubborn, wonderful Sam, still looking for her, still believing in her. The pain of what she had cost him was sharp as any blade. He's joined with a group of civilian trackers, Daniel continued. They search systematically, questioning everyone. Eventually they'll piece together the truth, she finished, that I chose to help you, that I left willingly. What will you do when that time comes? She was quiet for a long moment, watching sparks rise from the fire to join the emerging stars. I am Cheyenne now. This is my family, my people. But Sam, he deserves to know I'm alive. He deserves the truth, even if he can't understand it. Before Daniel could respond, a commotion arose from the camp's edge. Scouts were riding in hard, their urgency cutting through the celebration like a knife. Thomas strode toward them, his expression shifting from joy to concern as they reported. The news spread quickly through the camp. Army patrols had been spotted 2 valleys over, moving in force. This was not a standard patrol, but a major expedition. Possibly retribution for recent raids, possibly something more targeted. The celebration atmosphere evaporated like morning dew. Warriors began preparing weapons. Women started packing essential items. Children were gathered close. This was the reality of life for the Cheyenne. Joy and danger intertwined. Celebration and survival in constant tension. Thomas found Blue Sky Woman as she helped Morning Song pack medical supplies. We must move the camp, he said without preamble. The army comes in strength. Our scouts count at least 200 soldiers. Do they search for me? She asked, dreading the answer, perhaps in part. But this feels larger. Winter campaigns are rare, too harsh, too dangerous. Something drives them. His expression was grim. We leave at first light. Can you ride hard? We may need to split up, regroup later. Blue Sky Woman nodded. I can ride. That night, her first as an adopted member of the tribe, was spent in preparation for flight rather than continued celebration. She worked alongside the other women, learning how a camp of hundreds could be dismantled and packed with remarkable efficiency. Everything had its place, its method of transport. What seemed like chaos was actually a well-rehearsed dance of survival. By dawn, the camp was gone. Where teepees had stood, only circles of pressed earth remained. The ceremonial ground where Blue Sky Woman had received her name showed no sign of the previous day's gathering. The people moved out in organized groups. Warriors ranging ahead and to the flanks, women and children in the protected center, elderly and wounded with the travois. Blue Sky Woman rode with Morning Song's group, her position marking her as family, but also as someone still learning. The pace was hard, but not panicked. This was not the first time the people had needed to move quickly, and it would not be the last. On the second day of travel, as they crossed a frozen stream that marked the boundary between hunting territories, outriders brought word that changed everything. A small group of white men had been spotted trailing them, Not soldiers, but civilians. And their leader matched the description of Sam Holloway. Thomas called a halt, gathering his senior warriors for counsel. Blue Sky Woman was included, both because the situation involved her directly and because her adoption gave her the right to speak in such matters. "Your husband follows," Thomas said simply, "with 5 other men. They are not hostile. They show no weapons, carry a white flag, but they follow persistently." Blue Sky Woman felt her heart racing. Sam had found them, or at least their trail. The moment she had both dreaded and somehow expected had arrived. "I should go to him," she said. "Explain." "It could be a trap," suggested Spotted Eagle. "Use the woman to draw us out, then attack." "Sam wouldn't do that," Blue Sky Woman protested, then caught herself. Would he? Did she really know what Sam might do in his desperate search for? Her war changed people, twisted loyalties, made strangers of loved ones. 6 men are no threat to us, Thomas decided, but neither can we have them following us to our winter grounds. We will send a delegation to speak with them. Blue Sky, "Woman, you will come, but you stay back until we know their intentions." The meeting was arranged for the following dawn, in a small valley where both sides could see clearly and neither could ambush the other. Blue Sky Woman watched from a ridge as Thomas and 3 warriors rode down to meet the white men. Her heart pounded as she recognized Sam's familiar silhouette, the way he sat his horse, the gesture he made when nervous. The parley lasted longer than expected. She could see gestures, movement, but couldn't hear words. Finally, Thomas turned and signaled for her to approach. The ride down that slope felt eternal. Each step of her horse brought her closer to a confrontation she both needed and feared. When she was close enough to see Sam's face clearly, she nearly gasped. He looked haggard, worn down by weeks of searching, his cheeks hollow and eyes shadowed. But when he saw her, his expression transformed, relief, joy, confusion, and hurt all warring for dominance. "Ruth!" His voice was hoarse, disbelieving. "My God, Ruth, is it really you?" She stopped her horse a few paces away, acutely aware of her Cheyenne dress, her braided hair, the way she sat her mount with the natural ease she'd learned from weeks of hard riding. "Hello, Sam," she said quietly. "I knew you were alive." "He," said, words tumbling out. "Everyone said you were taken, killed maybe, but I knew. I found your letter. I understood why you helped him, Ruth. I do. But why did you leave? Why didn't you wait for me?" How could she explain? How could she make him understand the chain of choices that had led from that moment in the root cellar to this moment on a windswept plain? How could she bridge the chasm between his world and the one she now inhabited? "I had to leave," she began carefully. "The soldiers would have arrested me, tried me for treason. You know that's true. I would have protected you. We could have explained..." "Explained what? That I harbored an enemy scout? That I gave him medical aid? That I chose compassion over duty?" Her voice grew stronger. "They would have hanged me, Sam, or imprisoned me. You know the mood since Little Bighorn." Sam's horse shifted restlessly, responding to his agitation. "So you chose them? These people who kill settlers, who raid our supply lines, who defend their land," she interrupted, "who protect their families, who took me in when my own people would have condemned me." She gestured to Thomas and the others. "They saved my life, Sam. And today I chose to become one of them." The words hung in the cold air like ice crystals. Sam's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, betrayal, anger, and finally a deep, profound sadness. "You're my wife," he said quietly. "Before God and man, you're my wife." "I know," Blue Sky Woman replied, and her voice carried its own sadness. "And I will always love the man who built a homestead with me, who dreamed of children and crops and peaceful days." But that life ended the night I chose to save a wounded man. I can't go back, Sam. Not to a world that would punish mercy. Then come away with me, he pleaded. Not back to the fort, not to judgment. We'll go east, start over. No one needs to know what happened here. For a moment, the offer hung between them like a bridge over an abyss. Blue Sky Woman could see that life. A small farm in Illinois, perhaps, or a shop in St. Louis. New names, new stories, the past buried and forgotten. She and Sam rebuilding their life together, having the children they'd planned, growing old, in anonymous peace. But even as the vision formed, she knew it was impossible. She had been transformed not just by ceremony, but by experience. She had found a different way of seeing the world, of understanding community, of defining family. The woman Sam had married no longer existed, and the woman she had become could not live in the narrow confines of a lie. I can't, she said simply. I'm not that person anymore. I'm Blue Sky Woman now. This is my family. These are my people. Sam's shoulders sagged. Behind him, one of his companions muttered something, but Sam silenced him with a gesture. When he looked up again, tears gathered in his eyes. I'll wait, he said desperately, however long it takes. When this war ends, when peace comes, I'll be waiting. Blue Sky Woman felt her own tears threatening. This good man, this loving husband, offering to wait for something that would never come. She wanted to spare him that pain, but she knew words wouldn't be enough. Only time would teach him what she had learned, that some transformations cannot be undone. Don't wait, Sam, she said gently. Find someone who can be the wife you deserve, have the children we dreamed of, live the life we planned, just live it without me. Thomas, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, spoke then. The sun rises higher. We must move on. His tone was respectful but firm. The safety of the people came before personal drama. Sam looked like he wanted to say more, to argue, to plead. But faced with the implacable reality of mounted warriors and the vast wilderness that surrounded them, he finally nodded. I'll tell them you died, he said quietly. Taken by fever during captivity. It's kinder than the truth. Thank you, Blue Sky Woman whispered. As the two groups separated, she turned in her saddle for one last look. Sam sat motionless on his horse, watching her ride away. She raised her hand once in farewell, then turned her face toward the mountains, where her people were heading. The journey to the winter camp took another week. Blue Sky Woman rode in a kind of daze at first, grief and relief warring within her. The other women gave her space to process what had happened, but their presence was constant and comforting. She was not alone in her sorrow. Many of them had lost husbands, homes, former lives. They understood the price of transformation. Winter camp, when they finally reached it, was a revelation, hidden in a valley protected by high ridges, with hot springs that kept certain areas warm, even in deep winter. It was a place of relative safety and surprising comfort. Here, the people could rest, repair, prepare for whatever spring might bring. Blue Sky Woman threw herself into winter life with the energy of someone who has finally found where they belong. She learned to work hides until they were soft as cloth, to decorate moccasins with intricate beadwork, to prepare pemmican that would last through the lean months. Her language skills improved daily, and she began to dream in Cheyenne. She also found herself taking on a unique role within the tribe. Her medical knowledge, combined with Morning Song's traditional healing, proved remarkably effective. Together, they treated everything from minor wounds to difficult births, earning Blue Sky Woman respect that had nothing to do with her dramatic adoption story. As winter deepened, news from the outside world came sporadically through traders and scouts. The military campaigns had slowed but not stopped. There were rumors of new policies, of reservation boundaries being redrawn, of pressures that would only increase come spring. One evening, as Blue Sky Woman sat with Morning Song, preparing medicines, the older woman spoke thoughtfully. Change comes whether we will it or not. Our world grows smaller each season. The buffalo disappear. The settlers multiply like spring grass. What will you do when we can no longer live as we do now? It was a question Blue Sky Woman had been avoiding, but she knew Morning Song was right. The traditional life of the Plains tribes was under assault from all sides. Even in this hidden valley, they could not escape forever. I'll adapt, she said finally, as you have, as we all must, but I'll do it as Cheyenne, not as white. That choice is made. Morning Song smiled. You understand then, being Cheyenne is not about living in teepees or hunting buffalo. It is about keeping the heart of who we are, even as the world changes around us. Spring came late that year, but when it arrived, it brought with it the inevitable pressure to move, to find new hunting grounds, to stay ahead of military patrols. But it also brought unexpected news through a trader who specialized in moving between worlds. Sam Holloway had left the frontier. He had resigned his commission, sold the homestead, and headed east. He had told people his wife had died during Indian captivity, just as he'd promised. But the trader, who had a talent for hearing things, not meant for his ears, said Sam had also left letters with various trading posts, letters for Ruth, in case she ever came looking for her old life. Blue Sky Woman received this news with mixed emotions. Relief that Sam had moved on, sadness for the pain she had caused him, and a deep gratitude that he had protected her choice, even as it broke his heart. She kept one of those letters when it eventually found its way to her through the trader network. It was simple, heartfelt, and final. Ruth, I pray this finds you well and happy in the life you've chosen. I don't understand it, maybe I never will, but I saw something in your eyes that day that told me you had found where you belong. I'm going back to Ohio, to my family's farm. I'll try to build a new life, though I doubt I'll ever love again as I loved you. Be well, be happy, be whoever you need to be. Sam. As Blue Sky Woman read these words by firelight in her teepee, surrounded by the sounds of the camp settling for the night, she felt a chapter of her life close with gentle finality. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, the need to move camp again, rumors of new military strategies, the ongoing struggle to preserve a way of life in the face of overwhelming change. But tonight, she was simply Blue Sky Woman, sitting by her fire, at peace with her choices. She had saved a life and found her own. She had lost one family and gained another. She had discovered that identity is not fixed by birth or marriage, but can be chosen, earned, lived into being. The stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had watched her transformation from frontier wife to adopted Cheyenne. In the distance, wolves howled, their voices carrying messages older than human division. And Blue Sky Woman, no longer caught between worlds but fully inhabiting the one she had chosen, added her own voice to the night, a Cheyenne lullaby she sang to the child. Of a tribeswoman who had become her sister, the circle was complete, the transformation was real. And in the vast wilderness of the American West, where cultures clashed and lives were forever altered by the choices of individuals, one woman's decision to help a wounded enemy had led to a new definition of home, family, and self. The moon rose full and bright, the same moon that had witnessed her adoption ceremony, but Blue Sky Woman no longer needed its light to show her the way. She had found her path, walked it with courage, and arrived at a destination she could never have imagined when she first heard those labored breaths behind her woodshed on that fateful autumn night. In choosing compassion over fear, she had lost one life and gained another, and in the end, that was enough, that was everything. The seasons turned like pages in a book, each one writing new chapters in Blue Sky Woman's life among the Cheyenne. 5 winters had passed since her adoption ceremony, 5 cycles of buffalo hunts and berry harvests, war councils and peace talks, births and deaths that wove her ever deeper into the fabric of the people. The world beyond their camps was changing. With frightening speed, the transcontinental railroad had been completed, bringing waves of settlers that crashed against the traditional territories like an endless tide. The great buffalo herds that had once blackened the plains were dwindling, hunted to near extinction by hide hunters who left the carcasses to rot under the prairie sun. Treaties were made and broken with such regularity that even the most optimistic among the people had stopped believing in the white man's promises. Blue Sky Woman had changed too. Her skin had weathered to a warm bronze from years of sun and wind. Her hands, once soft from indoor work, were now strong and skilled in the crafts of her adopted people. She could brain tan a hide as well as any woman in the tribe, could identify healing plants by scent alone, could read the subtle signs of weather and wildlife that meant survival or disaster on the open plains. But perhaps the greatest change was in her spirit. The woman who had once been Ruth Holloway, frontier wife, uncertain of her place in the world, had become a respected member of the tribe, known for her healing skills and her ability to bridge 2 cultures when necessary. She served as translator during the increasingly frequent negotiations with military officials and government agents, though each meeting left her more discouraged about the future. On this particular morning, as spring struggled to assert itself against winter's lingering grip, Blue Sky Woman made her way through the camp with practiced ease. The village had been forced to relocate 3 times over the winter, staying ahead of cavalry patrols that seemed determined to push them onto the reservation at Fort Sill. Each move had been harder than the last, with fewer young warriors to protect them and more elders and children to slow their pace. She found Daniel Blackwolf sitting outside his lodge, working on a new bow. The years had added lines to his face and a few grey strands to his hair, but his hands remained steady on his work. Their friendship had deepened over time, built on the foundation of that first life-saving encounter, but grown into something richer. The bond between 2 people who had seen each other at their most vulnerable and chosen trust over fear. The scouts report soldiers massing at Fort Wallace, he said without looking up from his work. More than we've seen before. Something is coming. Blue Sky Woman settled beside him, accepting the cup of pine needle tea his wife offered. Thomas speaks of treating with them again. He believes we might negotiate safe passage to the Powder River country. Daniel's hands stilled on the bow. My brother hopes too much. The whites want us penned like cattle, not roaming free. These new soldiers, they bring with them orders from Washington. The scouts heard them speaking of a final solution to the Indian problem. The phrase sent a chill through Blue Sky Woman. She had heard such language before, in the darkest days after Little Bighorn, when revenge had driven policy more than reason. But this felt different, more organized, more inevitable. Where is Morning Song? She asked, changing the subject to something that had been troubling her. Gone to the Women's Council. They debate whether to send the children north with Red Leaf's band. The grandmothers believe splitting up offers better chances for some to survive. The casual way he spoke of survival, as if it were a question, rather than a certainty, struck Blue Sky Woman forcibly. When had they stopped speaking of living and started speaking only of surviving? When had the future become something to be endured rather than embraced? That afternoon brought visitors to the camp, a small delegation of Lakota led by a young warrior named Runs at Dawn. They carried news from the north. Sitting Bull had crossed into Canada with his people, seeking refuge from the American military. Crazy Horse was dead, killed at Fort Robinson under circumstances that remained murky. The great alliance that had won at Little Bighorn was scattered like leaves before a storm. The council that night was somber. Blue Sky Woman attended in her role as translator and advisor, watching as the leadership debated their dwindling options. Some argued for following Sitting Bull's path to Canada. Others spoke of surrendering to the reservation system, believing it better to preserve their people in captivity than lose them to endless warfare. A few still counseled resistance, but their voices carried the desperate edge of those who know their cause is lost. Thomas Blackwolf, showing the weariness of a war chief who had led his people through 5 years of running battles and forced migrations, finally spoke. "We are like the beaver," he said slowly. "Once we built our lodges throughout this land. Now the trappers have taken our streams, and we must choose. Fight until the last beaver is skinned, or find new waters where we might survive." The debate continued long into the night, with no clear consensus emerging. Blue Sky Woman translated when needed, but mostly observed, feeling the weight of impossible choices pressing down on everyone present. As she walked back to her lodge, under a canopy of cold stars, she found herself thinking of Sam, somewhere in Ohio, probably believing her dead these 5 years. What would he think if he could see her now, sitting in war councils, debating the fate of a people he had been trained to see as enemies? The next morning brought the crisis everyone had been expecting, but hoping to avoid. Scouts rode in at full gallop, reporting a massive military force moving toward them, not just cavalry but infantry and artillery as well. This was no patrol or punitive expedition. This was an army intent on ending the free-roaming bands once and for all. The Chu camp exploded into organized chaos. Warriors prepared weapons and painted themselves for battle. Women packed essentials and prepared travois for the elderly and wounded. Children were gathered and instructed to stay close to their mothers. But underneath the activity was a current of despair. Everyone knew they could not outrun such a force forever, could not fight artillery with bows and arrows. Blue Sky Woman worked alongside Morning Song in preparing medical supplies, knowing they would be needed regardless of what came next. As they sorted herbs and rolled bandages, the older woman spoke quietly. "I dreamed of you last night," Morning Song said. "You stood at a place where 3 rivers meet, and in each river ran a different color, red for blood, white for tears, blue for hope. You had to choose which to follow." "What did I choose in your dream?" Blue Sky Woman asked. "I woke before. You decided. But I think the dream was not about choosing one over the others. I think it was about understanding that all 3 flow to the same sea." Before Blue Sky Woman could ask what she meant, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention, but these were not their own scouts returning. A small party rode into camp under a white flag. Military officers accompanied by a civilian she recognized with a start. Agent James McKinnon, with whom she had negotiated twice before on behalf of the tribe. Thomas met them with his senior warriors, and Blue Sky Woman was called to translate. The message was stark in its simplicity. Surrender now and be escorted peacefully to the reservation, or face the full might of the assembled forces. "You have until sunset to decide," the lead officer, a Colonel Patterson, announced. "After that, we will consider any continued resistance as an act of war." As the delegation prepared to leave, Agent McKinnon lingered, gesturing for Blue Sky Woman to approach. "Mrs. Holloway," he said quietly, using the name she hadn't heard in years. "I know who you are. I've known for some time. Your husband searched, and for you for over a year before accepting your death. Did you know he remarried, has 2 children now?" The news hit her like a physical blow, though she kept her expression neutral. Of course, Sam had moved on. She had told him to. But hearing it confirmed, knowing he had found the family life they had once planned together, stirred unexpected emotions. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because I can offer you a way out," McKinnon replied. "Testify that you were held captive all these years, that you were forced to participate in tribal life against your will. I can arrange for you to be separated from the others, given safe passage east. You could resume your old life, or at least a version of it." Blue Sky Woman stared at him, understanding dawning. "You want me to betray my people, to support whatever narrative justifies what you're about to do. I'm offering you salvation," McKinnon insisted. "These people are finished. Their way of life is ending, whether you stand with them or not. Why die for a lost cause?" She thought of the ceremonies that had bound her to the tribe, of morning songs, patient teaching, of children calling her auntie, of 5 years of joys and sorrows shared. She thought of Daniel, whose life she had saved, and who had repaid that debt 1,000 times over through friendship and acceptance. She thought of what it meant to choose a people, to become part of something larger than oneself. "Agent McKinnon," she said formally, "please inform Colonel Patterson that the Cheyenne will give their answer at sunset, as requested." The agent's face hardened as he understood her choice. "You're a fool, Mrs. Holloway. History will not be kind to Indian lovers and race traitors." "Perhaps not," Blue Sky Woman replied calmly, "but I would rather be judged harshly by history than live as a betrayer of those who took me in when my own people would have hanged me." As the delegation rode away, the camp returned to its preparations with renewed urgency. The council met again, and this time the debate was shorter. They would not surrender to be penned on a reservation where their children would be taken to boarding schools, their religion outlawed, their identity slowly strangled. But neither could they fight the assembled might of the U.S. Army with their depleted numbers. "We scatter," Thomas announced finally. "Like quail when the hawk dives, small groups have better chances than one large target. Some may reach Canada. Others might find refuge with reservation bands willing to hide them. We meet again when the berry's moon rises, if the spirits will it." The dissolution of the camp began immediately. Families grouped together, supplies were divided, plans were made for various routes and destinations. Blue Sky Woman found herself assigned to a group led by Daniel, comprising mostly women, children, and elderly, with a small warrior escort. They would attempt to reach the Wind River country, where northern Arapaho allies might offer shelter. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the various groups prepared to depart. There were hurried farewells, blessings exchanged, children crying as they were separated from playmates. Blue Sky Woman helped an elderly woman named Singing Bird onto a travois, the same woman who had been skeptical of her adoption years ago, but who now squeezed her hand with affection. "You have a good heart, Blue Sky Woman," Singing Bird said. "I was wrong to doubt you. The spirits knew what they were doing when they brought you to us." Thomas Blackwolf approached as their group, prepared to move out. The war chief, who had first decided to trust her, looked older than his years, worn down by the responsibility of leadership in impossible times. "Watch over my brother," he said simply, "and remember, being Cheyenne is not about where we live or how we dress. It is about keeping the sacred ways alive in our hearts." The groups departed as the sun touched the horizon, scattering in different directions like seeds blown by the wind. Blue Sky Woman rode beside the travois, carrying Singing Bird, her rifle ready, her medicine bag at her side. Behind them, the abandoned camp looked forlorn in the fading light, circles of pressed earth and cold fire pits, the only sign that a community had existed there just hours before. They traveled through the night, using skills learned over 5 years of evading pursuit. The children were remarkably quiet, understanding instinctively that their lives depended on silence. The warriors ranged ahead and to the flanks, watching for danger, while the main group followed paths known only to those who had traveled this land for generations. As dawn broke over the plains, they paused to rest in a copse of cottonwoods near a small stream. Blue Sky Woman was helping distribute pemmican to the children when one of the scouts rode in fast. Soldiers had been spotted to the south, moving in their general direction, but not yet aware of their presence. "We must push harder," Daniel decided. "The horses are tired, but we cannot rest here." They moved on, exhaustion weighing on everyone, but especially the elderly and the very young. Blue Sky Woman found herself carrying a toddler whose mother was nursing an infant. The child's weight, familiar from countless similar moments over the years. This was what it meant to be part of a people, to share burdens, to put collective survival above individual comfort, to find strength in unity, even as that unity was being torn apart by forces beyond their control. On the third day, as they neared the foothills that promised better cover, disaster struck. A cavalry patrol spotted them crossing open ground. There was no time for elaborate evasion. They could only run for the rocky terrain ahead and hope to find defensive positions. The chase was brutal and swift. The soldiers, fresher and better mounted, gained ground steadily. Daniel and the other warriors prepared to make a stand, buying time for the women and children to reach cover. Blue Sky Woman found herself torn between her healer's instinct to stay with the wounded and her fighter's knowledge that every rifle would count. "Go with the children," Daniel ordered when he saw her hesitation. "They need protection too." But Blue Sky Woman had not survived 5 years on the frontier by being meek. "I can shoot better than half your warriors," she replied, checking her ammunition. "And someone needs to tend wounds when the fighting starts." The battle, when it came, was brief but vicious. The Cheyenne warriors used the terrain brilliantly, making the soldiers pay for every yard of ground. But numbers and firepower told. In the end, as Blue Sky Woman worked frantically to treat a warrior's shattered shoulder, she heard Daniel cry out in pain. She reached him as he fell, a bullet through his thigh, blood spreading rapidly. As she worked to stop the bleeding, pressing, her hands against the wound, time seemed to fold back on itself. She was simultaneously the frontier wife in a root cellar, treating a wounded enemy, and the adopted Cheyenne woman on a battlefield, trying to save her brother's life. "Ironic," Daniel gasped through pain-clenched teeth. "It ends as it began." "It's not ending," Blue Sky Woman said fiercely, tying off a tourniquet. "You survived before, you'll survive again." But even as she spoke, she could hear the soldiers advancing, could see their warriors falling back, could feel the inevitable closing in, like a tightening noose. The children and elders had made it to the rocks, but they were trapped now, surrounded, out of options. The shooting gradually died down, replaced by shouted demands for surrender. Blue Sky Woman helped Daniel to cover behind a boulder, then looked around at their small band, perhaps 30 souls, half of them children, many wounded, all exhausted. They had no food, little water, and were outnumbered 5 to 1. A voice called out in English. She recognized Lieutenant Morrison, one of the officers from Fort Wallace. "We know you're with them, Mrs. Holloway. Come out peacefully, and we can still arrange something. You don't have to die with these hostiles." That word, hostiles, crystallized everything for Blue Sky Woman. To the soldiers, these people she had lived with, loved with, suffered with for 5 years were just obstacles to be removed, problems to be solved. But to her, they were family. Singing Bird, who had taught her to bead. Little Fox, whose birth she had attended last winter. Runs Far, the boy who had shown her where the best berries grew. Each face was a story, a connection, a thread in the web of belonging she had woven, through choice and commitment. She stood up slowly, making herself visible to the soldiers below. "My name is Blue Sky Woman," she called out in a clear voice. "I am Cheyenne by adoption, by choice, and by sacred oath. These are my people. Their fate is my fate." A murmur ran through the trapped band. Some of the women began to sing, a strong song, a death song, but also a song of affirmation. "We are still here," it said. "Despite everything, we survive." Lieutenant Morrison called out again. "This is your last chance, Mrs. Holloway. Step away from them, and you can go free. Stay, and you'll be treated as one of them." Blue Sky Woman looked around at the faces of her people, tired, frightened, but somehow still unbroken. She thought of all the choices that had led her to this moment, all the small decisions that had transformed her from Ruth Holloway, uncertain, frontier wife, into Blue Sky Woman, daughter of the Cheyenne. "I have already chosen," she replied. What happened next would be recorded differently by different witnesses. The military reports would state that the hostiles refused to surrender and were subdued with minimal casualties. The oral histories of the Cheyenne would remember it as another link in the long chain of broken promises and forced removals. But for Blue Sky Woman, standing with her people as the soldiers advanced, it was simply the logical conclusion of a journey that began with compassion and ended with belonging. They were taken to Fort Sill, the reservation in Oklahoma that would become home to the remnants of the Southern Cheyenne. The journey was hard, especially for the wounded, but Blue Sky Woman worked tirelessly to keep everyone alive. Daniel survived, though he would walk with a limp for the rest of his days. Singing Bird died on the trail, her last words a blessing for the white woman who had become a true daughter of the people. At Fort Sill, there were attempts to separate Blue Sky Woman from the others, to process her as a recovered captive rather than a voluntary member of the tribe. She resisted with such fierce determination that eventually the authorities gave up. Her legal status remained murky. Was she white or Indian, citizen or ward of the government? But her cultural identity was crystal clear to everyone who dealt with her. The reservation years were hard. The proud horsemen of the plains were forced to become farmers on insufficient land. Children were taken to boarding schools where their hair was cut and their language forbidden. Traditional ceremonies were outlawed, though they continued in secret. Blue Sky Woman worked as a translator and teacher, trying to help her people navigate the bewildering maze of government regulations while preserving what they could of their heritage. She never saw Sam again, though word occasionally reached her of his life in Ohio, the farm he ran, the children he raised, the respectable citizen he had become. Sometimes she wondered what would have happened if she had chosen differently that morning in the root cellar, if she had turned Daniel over to the authorities and maintained her place in white society. But these were idle thoughts, quickly dismissed. She had chosen the harder path, but it had led her to a deeper understanding of what it meant to be human. Years later, when a new generation of Cheyenne children gathered around her to hear stories of the old days, Blue Sky Woman would tell them about choice and belonging, about bridges between worlds, about the courage it takes to become who you are meant to be, rather than who others expect you to be. "Remember," she would say, her hair now gray but her voice still strong, "we are defined not by the blood in our veins, but by the paths we choose to walk. I was born white, but I chose to live Cheyenne. In that choosing, I found my true self." The children would nod solemnly, not fully understanding yet, but storing the words away for future contemplation. And Blue Sky Woman would smile, knowing that seeds of wisdom, like seeds of grass, sometimes take years to sprout, but once rooted, can survive the harshest drought. On reservation land that was a far cry from the open plains they had once roamed, surrounded by a people whose world had been forever changed, Blue Sky Woman lived out her days as she had chosen to live them, as a bridge between cultures, a healer of bodies and spirits, a keeper of stories, and above all as a member of the community that had accepted her when acceptance itself was an act of courage. When she died in the winter of 1913 at the age of 68, she was mourned not as Ruth Holloway, the frontier wife who had disappeared, but as Blue Sky Woman, beloved daughter of the Cheyenne, whose life proved that family is not just about birth, but about choice, commitment, and the courage to cross the boundaries that divide us. Her gravestone, in the small cemetery at Fort Sill, bore inscriptions in both English and Cheyenne. But it was the Cheyenne words that captured her essence. She chose us, and we chose her. In that choosing, we all became more than we were. The story of Blue Sky Woman became part of tribal history, told and retold around winter fires, evolving, with each telling but always maintaining its core truth, that in the most divided of times, one person's choice to see humanity instead of enemy, to offer help instead of hatred, could transform not just individual lives, but the very definition of belonging. And in the end, that was her greatest legacy. Not just that she had saved a life that autumn night in 1876, but that in doing so, she had discovered the infinite capacity of the human heart to expand beyond the boundaries of birth and culture, finding family wherever compassion leads. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.